Chapter 22. Darkness Full of Light. The needle pushed back and forth through Sabrina's skin, the filament trailing, gently pulling the jagged pieces of flesh together. The wound resembled a grotesque mouth. "Don't watch," Sprocket said, leaning over her, the headlamp strapped to his forehead shining in her eyes. He was quiet and intent as he performed the minor surgery. Sabrina ignored his order. She wasn't sure if it was the painkillers they had given her or the blows to her head, but a sense of dislocation from her body had taken over, allowing her to watch as Sprocket and Lindsey picked pebbles from her abrasions and poked holes through her skin with needles heated in candle flames. Lindsey, like Sprocket, was quiet as she worked, but there was a light in her eyes, something more than relief. It was beyond joy. It was something akin to rapture. Like so many others, she believed that they all indeed had witnessed a miracle. If they knew how much it hurt, they would realize there was nothing miraculous about it. Sprocket moved to closing the cut over her eye, each catch of thread on her skin sending stabs of pain down her face. With the sound of feet scuffling and men grunting, Grange, Denalius, and two others carried Bran in, squeezing around one another in the small, irregularly shaped chamber as they lowered him onto a cot. Bran was awake and alert, grumbling that their help was unnecessary. "Just need a splash of water, that's all," he insisted. "Away, runts!" Denalis's voice boomed. A wall of curious children stood in the hallway, staring at Sabrina. Their heads were protected from the chill of the cave by hoods. Tears in their garments had been repaired with packaging twine, or even cactus fibers. Their eyes were wide, but sunken in faces made slender by hunger. A tree branch stripped of bark had been set in the stone on either side of the entrance to act as a curtain rod. Denalius waved them away again and yanked the curtain closed. "Away, or you will end up in my cooking pot!" Sabrina could not move her head to see them, but the children's laughter reached her ears while Sprocket continued to work on her brow. It was such a welcome sound. She tried to form the words to remind Lindsey of when they were young, playing on the playground, climbing orange trees, skipping stones in the surf at the shore, but only mumbles came out. Sprocket made a soft shushing sound as Lindsey squeezed her hand. Sprocket's was a delicate touch, honed from working on precision machines and electronics. She was grateful for it now. The rush of the fight was fading, replaced by a fatigue so immense that it swallowed any sense of triumph. Sabrina could swear that the atoms of her body were merging with those of the cot. If she closed her eyes, she could even see the dance of electrons crisscrossing orbits while their nuclei rose and fell like soap bubbles on the wind. When Sprocket announced that he was finished, she felt startled. She had drifted off to sleep. A thumb peeled back her eyelid, and his headlamp blinded her. She squinted, but Sprocket's finger was firm. "I'm checking you for a concussion. Any dizziness?" "No." "Good. Sleep then." The light clicked off, followed by the sound of closing med kits, and he and Lindsey were gone, the curtain slipping closed behind them. Sabrina and Bran lay on cots on either side of the chamber. A blanket rested on top of her, keeping her warm against the chill of the cave and the cold packs they had placed on her right leg. She tried to recall the snippets of the conversation she had overheard while in and out of dozing. Denalius chasing children, Lindsey asking for more bandages and ointment, and humming softly as she spread a salve on Sabrina's wounds. That soft sound was Sabrina's favorite. She closed her eyes and did her best to fall into the memory of it. A passing voice in the hallway woke her. The steps were already receding as she shifted on the cot, her bruises, cuts, and abrasions causing her to twitch in pain, wrenching her from her relaxed stupor. The cot on the other side of the room creaked, and she realized Bran was still there. They were alone. "Bran?" she asked. She turned to her side to look at him, the movement causing new pain to flare throughout her body, further awakening her. Bran was cast in bright relief by a portable glow lamp on the floor, while the shadow of his own body loomed on the wall behind him like a specter. His shirt was unbuttoned, and he was still dusty from their days on patrol. His hair was freshly wet, and his cheeks glistened with water. A basin rested on the floor beside him. Dark red bruises shading to purple were forming on his neck. One of his boots had come untied, the laces dangling over the edge of the cot. She hesitated only a moment before realizing she did not feel a shred of self-consciousness. She thought it was the drugs, then recognized it as something more familiar, the fleeting intimacy that came after a bout. When dripping and sweating and covered with ice packs, she would lock eyes with an officer she had just beaten, and he would smile, ruefully. It was one of the only times she could feel on level with her male counterparts. The sensation would pass the moment another officer would enter. She would be ignored from then on. "Bran, you helped me. Even though I tried to kill you." He took a deep animal breath, his nostrils flaring, his big chest expanding, then deflating. The cot creaked again as he turned to face her, its mesh straining beneath the weight of his body. The pink glow bars of the lamp reflected in his eyes. "You have it wrong. I helped you because you tried to kill me." He folded his hands over his chest, leaned back, and closed his eyes. In a few moments, he was asleep. Theopin entered a while later, moving aside the curtain with a great flourish, unfazed that he might be disturbing them. Sabrina realized she had also slept and had no idea how long it had been. Minutes? Hours? Grange, Sprocket, and Lindsey followed, but hung back by the entryway. Theopin was no longer before a crowd, but he still moved his hands in grand gestures, like a stage actor trying to connect with his audience. The immediacy of the induction ceremony over, Sabrina had more time to study him. Like many of the unfamiliar faces she had glanced in the past hour, his seemed strangely familiar. Fortinbras is not a large city. I must have crossed paths with him before. She also could have just been confused from all the painkillers, so she shrugged off her thoughts and focused on Lindsey, who was speaking to her. "Theopin would like to show us something, if you have the strength." Lindsey was sitting down next to her. She had brought Sabrina a shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Of course I do," Sabrina said slowly, standing up and doing her best to ignore the sliver of pain that exploded from her feet and the way the room spun as she got up from the cot. She looked upon Bran, who was still resting comfortably, with some envy. "Excellent," Theopin said. The children had not been scared off by Denalis's threats. They formed a tight bunch outside the chamber, but parted slightly as Theopin stepped into their midst, touching their heads and complimenting one young girl on her beautiful eyes. He lifted her face so that the light from the dim lamp hanging overhead washed over her features. Sabrina could not help but notice the way all the children looked at him. Silently, expectantly. They began to close in around him, but he stopped them. Part ways. For us and our new sisters, Sabrina and Lindsey," he said. The walkways connecting the caverns were a mix of natural fissures and bored tunnels. As they passed chambers on their left and right, Sabrina could hear the mundane sounds of daily living. A broom sweeping a floor, a mother commanding her children, plates clattering, men laughing. Some of the passages were narrow enough for just one person to squeeze through. At other points they opened up as wide as a roadway. Overhead lamps provided light, although in the narrower passages the group moved mostly by feel. Here, the residents had an advantage over Sabrina and Lindsey, stepping over puddles, around obstacles, ducking low ceilings they had grown accustomed to. Theopin slowed for the newcomers, however, as he did for the gaggle of children following. The group passed rebels, wrapped in mismatched clothes to keep out the chill of the caves. Only the leaders wore robes like Theopin. The residents nodded, even bowed to Theopin and offered warm greetings to Sabrina and Lindsey, their new sisters. The group walked through the main hall again. The air was warmer and thick, with the smell of sweat, dust, and cooking oil. Only a few of the overhead lights remained on. The hall had been transformed in the time since the ceremony and the fight. The stage was dark and forgotten, the lights above rearranged to shine on a circle of women, each woman engaged in many tasks at once, whether it was nursing an infant in her lap, snapping beans, or talking with the others. Sabrina watched as one woman stood in the center of the circle and began to reenact the fight, imitating her movements, the bracelets on her arms jingling. The other women hooted and laughed. The tableau of women gathered in companionship, whether on a front porch or a cave, seemed eternal and unbroken. Sabrina wanted to remain, and repressed a wave of resentment as Theopin called for them to continue. From the main hall, the corridors led upwards. Theopin pointed out where the food was stored, as well as power cells. He stopped beside an empty tunnel, cocking his head slightly and raising his fingers to his lips for quiet so that Sabrina and Lindsey could hear the sound of rushing water. "We are blessed with abundance here," he said. "An underground river provides all the water we need." Lindsey made the appropriate noises of thanks and praise to the master while Sabrina pretended to be preoccupied with a young girl who had been following them and had just slipped on a wet stone. The rest of the way the air became redolent with the scents of the outside world, tamarisk, sage, and sun-baked granite. The walkways grew steeper, opening into a larger chamber that swirled with warm air from the outside. This chamber was teeming with rebels, and adjacent caverns functioned as shops and markets. Children carried scraps of clothing to one chamber where piles of cloth sat waiting to be sewn into patchwork long-sleeve shirts, trousers, and blankets. From another chamber came the smell of the sodium bicarbonate women were using to clean clothes. In another cave, men bent over the eclectic mixes of recovered electronics, cracked cases, wild nests of wires, and flickering palm screens. All products came together in a market of sorts set up near the cave mouth, where booths wedged tightly against each other displayed colorful mixes of spices, vegetables, clothes, stone, and wood carvings. It felt familiar and comforting to Sabrina, even if conversation stilled as she and Lindsey passed. She did not see any guns until they reached the cave mouth. The guards were only boys, wearing oversized uniforms in different shades of desert khaki. Their rifles were old, with scratched and worn wooden stocks, but they clasped them close to their chests with white knuckles. They saluted Theopin with earnest, stiff movements, their eyes locked and staring out into the purple evening sky. "No signs of patrols, sir," one said. "And the last of the gathering groups are in." "I am pleased to hear that. Carry on, brothers," Theopin said softly, clasping the nearest boy on the shoulder as he passed, his sober expression matching theirs. The remaining children following them stopped at the cave mouth. The dry desert air felt thin and warm, even though a cool evening breeze was blowing down the valley, shaking curdy bushes and acacia trees, disturbing the skylarks that searched their branches for a final meal before nightfall. The cave mouth was halfway up a rocky hill. Below them, the slope was covered in aprons of scree. Above, the rock was steeper, displaying walls of folded strata that piled one atop another toward the starry sky. Theopin led them along a narrow path while Sabrina and Lindsey followed, bunched close together. "They are young," Lindsey said of the boy guards. "Too young," Sabrina said. The path proved less than well-traveled, and they moved slowly over jagged stones and around thorn trees with menacing thorns ready to rip flesh. Other rebels passed them on their way back to the cave mouth, no one following the same path as the other, their feet occasionally slipping on the loose stone. Each passing believer wore a contemplative expression and cast their eyes out to the west, where stars hung low over the building evening haze. They did not greet Sabrina or Lindsey. Theopin was taking a particular section of the hill face slowly when he slipped, pebbles skittering away beneath his sandals. He toppled, catching himself on a thorn tree. Lindsey gasped, but he smiled calmly, his hand wrapped around a thorn-covered branch as he steadied himself. "No need to worry, sister. It appears I missed the thorns. A small mercy from the master." "Let him be praised," Lindsey said, helping Theopin to his feet. "We are almost to our destination," he said. "I apologize for the route, but we must vary our paths, lest we wear a trail for the Elveds to see from the air." "Of course," Lindsey said. "Are you still feeling strong enough, Sister Sabrina?" Theopin asked, as she had seated herself on a stone, its warmth radiating through the seat of her clothes. "Yes," Sabrina said quickly. "I'm feeling better than I look." "Good," Theopin said and started again. He and Lindsey disappeared behind a large boulder, and Sabrina took a few more moments to catch her breath. In truth, her head had a vice tightening around it, and she was breathless from the waves of pain she felt with each step. But she would not leave Lindsey alone with Theopin for long. The thorn tree was just next to her. She reached for the same branch Theopin had clasped to help herself up, only to stop before she touched it. Thorns radiated from every inch, fresh blood dripping from their ends. So much for small mercies from the master. She caught up to Theopin and Lindsey at a deep fissure in the rock. They were removing their sandals before stepping onto the stone passageway. The gap was a crack in the mountain face, further narrowed by the boulders that had fallen and wedged themselves between the walls. It left barely enough space for a woman's shoulders to pass. Theopin had to turn sideways, the back of his robe rubbing against the stone. Sabrina removed her boots. The soil was fine and sandy. A cold draft breathed out of the darkness, heavy with the scent of earth, but with an additional smell that had not been present in the caves before. This smell was sweet and brought to the mind wildflowers, fresh tea, cinnamon, even muffins. She inhaled and savored it as she followed Lindsey, pressing herself against the limestone to see around her friend and watch Theopin. A light swam around the walls ahead and silhouetted his figure, his body black, his hands and face glowing with a faint gold sheen. The passage widened. In a chamber where they could stand abreast, Theopin stopped before a black curtain trimmed in shimmering gold embroidery. Veins of quartz ran at angles on either side of the rock opening. Sabrina sniffed the air again. The sweet smell was still strong, but now mixed with a chemical smell of polyepoxide, the epoxy used in construction sites. Theopin paused to look at them, a bit of theater Sabrina could have done without, before sweeping the curtain aside. They stepped into an amber dream. 1,000 tear-shaped flames flickered, cradled in sconces, or balanced on tapered candlesticks, copious figures of melting wax gathering at their bases. It was more candles than Sabrina had ever seen, even in the evidence lockers after major raids. There were so many that the room was filled with a pleasant warmth. The light danced against the uneven walls, playing with shadows and glittering in globules of epoxy. The polyepoxide glue held a mosaic of stones against the wall. Fluted shafts, chiseled figures, misshapen cornices were stuck in with a confusing, scattered fashion. A few fragments had faces, a woman with blind eyes, a man with flowing hair, a snarling demon. One wall held darkened slivers of a colored window, like the one Sabrina had seen at the ruins that morning. High overhead, the flowing, flame-like script swirled across green marble, a broken frieze with the blocky characters running in relief below. Against the farthest wall were dozens of stands holding the outlawed symbols of the underground, the moon, the sun, and the sword. They were jumbled together in a crowded forest of polished wood and metal. The air was sharp with the fumes given off by the epoxy, but the scent was softened by the overwhelming odor of the candles, many of which were made from beeswax and smelled of honey. Honey. Like I put in my tea and on my muffin. The floor was covered in tasseled carpets, drippings and piles of wax scattered across them. Lindsey swirled in a circle of delight. Theopin looked on, smiling, the candles reflecting in the liquid gleam of his eyes, erasing the smudges of dirt on his robe from the tight passage.
"Sabrina, I've seen this place," Lindsey said. "I saw it in my visions. Darkness full of light. We were meant to come here."
She stepped close to the wall, running her fingertips across an assortment of mismatched stones.
"Theopin, is this what I think it is?"
"What pieces of holy places we can recover all reside in this room, until a time comes when they can be openly displayed again."
Sabrina was well aware that she did not want that time to come. Not ever. She had seen fragments like these before in the satchels and pockets of scrits. Such stones could be found in the soil on the numbered hills overlooking Fortinbras. "You send the scrits," Sabrina said. "You send them for these pieces."
"Yes,"
Theopin said, turning to her slowly.
"Some of the children you saw earlier were born here. They do not know the ways of the cities, but when they come of age, they may make the pilgrimage to retrieve pieces of the holy places."
"What do you do to their memories?"
"We do nothing, my sister,"
Theopin said slowly.
"It is what the city does to them. You or I could return, But those born on the outside, they end up, as you call them, scrits. Their memories are impaired until they return to outside the city limits. This is why their instructions are written on their bodies in the language of the holy ancients. If believers find them, they help them. But thanks to the efforts of the ministry, and people like yourself, they do not all make it back.
Jacob was from here. His family is here.
Sabrina swallowed hard and reached out for the wall. Do not be troubled, Sister Sabrina. There will be time later to speak of the wrongdoings of our dear leader Dagosta. Not to worry. You are now one of us, and shall not be held to account for his transgressions. Tonight should be a night of thanks. I will leave the two of you.
Thank you, Theopin,
Lindsey said, her expression one of swooning devotion that Sabrina found detestable even in her best friend. After he had left, Sabrina slid down the wall to the floor, her legs sore and stitches throbbing. She fought a wave of nausea bubbling up in her stomach. With her eyes closed, she pressed her feet into the cold sand of the floor and her back into the wall of the cave, willing the coldness into her aches and Jacob out of her mind.
Were one of those faces that seemed familiar Jacob's relatives?
Lindsey made a slow circuit of the room, examining every hollow intently, even stopping to make her own shadows against the wall. A crescent moon with cupped palms, a sword with her fingers, although the sun with its six-pointed rays seemed to frustrate her.
So many candles, Sabrina sighed. So illegal.
Lindsey cut her circuit short and crossed to Sabrina, reaching out her hand.
Come on. Sit on the carpets.
I'd rather not. Please. It's strange enough to be here.
Lindsey frowned.
I'm sorry. I didn't think of how this must seem to you, diving in so deep. There are people in town who only hear about this place. It's like a legend. It's so...
holy?
Sacred.
Because of all the candlelight?
I don't understand it.
The shattered pieces. It's all a jumble. A ruin. Sadness.
Each piece represents a journey of faith and love. Like ours.
Ours was a journey of survival.
On the surface.
Lindsey sat down cross-legged on the carpet.
But look at you and those 5 men. It is as if the Master does have a plan.
Please stop. It was 4 men. Bran helped me.
Moved by the Master.
Moved by a need to get in my pants.
Sabrina, Lindsey said, raising her voice. You know he is a better man than that. Sabrina did not like being scolded, especially when she knew Lindsey was right. She sighed, changing the subject. How do you know the words Grange translates are different from any other words? That they are holy?
You just know.
Not good enough. There is no reasoning in that. Aren't we beyond irrationality in this day and age?
Oh, no. Irrationality is part of it,
Lindsey said, leaning forward, warming to the topic.
To embrace, to recognize the mystery of it all. You have to first recognize all the reasons against it. Otherwise, it's not faith. You have to separate all that logic of your mind from the feeling in your heart.
I don't think the men in the ring today were embracing the mystery of the feelings in their hearts.
Lindsey sighed but recovered her enthusiasm quickly, as if the room granted her new energy.
Maybe you were sent here to teach us.
Lindsey, please.
She had hurt her. Lindsey turned away, staring at the carpets and tracing the lines of a design with her finger. Lindsey on the carpet, Sabrina on the cave floor, her toes full of dirt, the gulf as wide as ever.
I'm sorry, Lindsey. The words.
Tell me about the words.
What about them?
What makes them holy? I'll keep an open mind.
Lindsey shrugged and did not answer, leading Sabrina to fear that she had been too insensitive. Lindsey began to tug 3 of her locks absent-mindedly and twist them into a braid. She released them and said,
The best I can offer is that it's like a joke. You can read many words, put them in any combination, then one certain combination makes you laugh. Change any word and it won't work. And you can't point to it and say, this word works with that word, because it's never like that. You just take it in, and you either laugh or you don't. You hear the words, you're moved, or you are not.
She shook her head.
But it's not just the words. The holy is in actions, too. The way Grange and the others cared for Wills. The way Bran helped you. Even Dag raising...
She stopped, reading Sabrina's expression.
I'm sorry. Never mind. I did not mean to bring him up.
No, it's fine. Even I forget sometimes. It does not seem real. A week ago I was studying for my evals. The thought dredged up a swirl of emotion she was not ready to face. Had she forfeited school? There was no doubt she would miss her evals. Not that they mattered anymore, since she was a turncoat, a criminal. She focused on a shadow dancing over the flowing black script. She had lost so much, and that was more painful than the physical wounds inflicted on her that day. The sweet smell of wax was thick in the air.
Lindsey, has there been any more of what you saw?
A pink wall, a framed picture of a sailboat. Nothing else.
Nothing?
I have not seen a thing since the drugs wore off,
Lindsey said, flicking one of the bells in her braids. Sabrina bit her swollen lip, then winced from the pain, forgetting it was split. Lindsey gathered herself up, unfolded, and in a swift motion leaned down and kissed Sabrina on the forehead.
I hope you come to know him, through my love for you.
Sure,
was all Sabrina could manage. Lindsey whirled, facing the stands at the far end of the room, the dark, exaggerated shadows of moons, suns, and swords, hovering like threatening doppelgangers over the glittering originals.
Can I ask your permission for something?
Go ahead.
Would you mind if I pray?
Sabrina swallowed a lump in her throat. She had to wait until her lips stopped trembling. In a thick voice, she said,
I've never stopped you from anything. I'm not going to start now.
Lindsey thanked her, moving across the rugs in a slow procession towards the distant front of the room, where she kneeled, then touched the floor with her forehead before rising again to her knees, her hands clasped together. Sabrina watched as long as she could before her vision blurred. She closed her eyes, buried her face in her knees, and let her shawl absorb her hot tears. Chapter 23. Thieves and Murderers. The woman was touching herself, caressing her neck and chest, absent-mindedly rubbing the tops of her thighs, then falling forward, her eyes closed in ecstasy, her hands clasped together as she responded to Theopin's words, spoken from the stage over the heads of an enraptured audience, crowded into the main hall. Between Theopin and the woman, in a small room that opened into the hall, stood a few hundred people, nearly all the believers who lived in the caves, packed closely together in the stifling air, silent as they listened to hear the words of their leader, words that mesmerized them like a spell, that caused them to forget the fetid air, their aching feet, and, in the case of the woman sitting across the corridor from Sabrina, any sense of self-consciousness and any burden of obligation to the children seated next to her. Sabrina snagged the hand of the woman's son, keeping him from sticking a clod of dirt into his mouth. His skeletal older sister stared at Sabrina with an expression devoid of emotion or connection. She looked to be 7 or 8 years old, but over the 3 weeks since coming to the rebel camp, Sabrina had learned that, like most of the children who were forced to live in the caves, she was likely older and stunted from the limited rations. The sound of Theopin's voice broke her reverie.
We all remember what we learned in school,
he said with a sarcastic emphasis.
Well, perhaps with the exception of Rickard here.
He gestured to a figure in the front row. The crowd laughed. Sabrina had learned that Rickard was the name of Tree Trunk, the man whose shoulder she had dislocated. He and the other soldiers often took up the front rows of the prayer assemblies, but the sense of order and hierarchy that the word soldier implied was absent among them. They answered only to Dr. Rindle or Theopin. Some preferred to report to Grange, but this was completely voluntary. And although Grange himself took pains to be obedient to Theopin, it was out of Grange's own sense of obligation. With the exception of those who reported to Grange, most soldiers never seemed to go out on patrol. They spent most of their time sleeping, eating, and laughing among themselves in the main hall. Theopin occasionally took them on trips away from the caves for reflection. Sabrina suspected that these trips were actually for more martial training, but she had no more proof than a hunch. Although she learned that most of the residents were grateful for those times when the soldiers were gone and the halls were quieter, they also seemed more on edge, their sense of vulnerability to attack from the ministry heightened. So they tolerated the soldiers and their boorishness out of some need for protection. Soldier or not, twice a week, all the rebels gathered for assembly, when Grange, Dr. Rindle, or another of Theopin's close advisors would share reflections, or read from forbidden texts that they had translated. Latecomers gathered in the shadows of the hallways where Sabrina now sat with the enraptured woman. By a trick of the caves, the sound was actually better in these corridors, and Sabrina could sit unseen and listen. She preferred it this way. She did not wish to give Theopin the pleasure of knowing that she attended. At about every other assembly Theopin spoke, and these were the days Sabrina made sure she did not miss. Not because she was beginning to believe, rather she was trying to understand the pull the man had on the soldiers and the rebels, on Grange, on the woman before her, and on Lindsey. Half the time Sabrina and Lindsey were together, her friend was in thrall of Theopin. His insight was so powerful, his words so moving, life-changing even. But other times, Lindsey would be somber and quiet, voicing her doubts and disagreements with some of Theopin's more martial proclamations. Lindsey made these admissions with embarrassment that bordered on shame. When Sabrina suggested that he was a charlatan, Lindsey had lashed out at her.
"What do you know? You're not even a believer!"
Only to immediately apologize. Sabrina had said little on the topic since. Now, when Lindsey was in her somber moods, she sought out Grange instead of Sabrina. So Sabrina listened, rolling and twisting the cords on the sleeves of her pullover until they were frayed and wet with sweat. She missed her patrol suit, but it had not been returned to her since her induction. Theopin moved across the stage, taking long steps towards the edge, as if he were about to walk into space, stopping short and wiping his brow. The air was soupy with dust, like a cloud that formed above a herd of animals. The odor of bodies and damp cotton clothes was overwhelming, but Theopin and his followers did not notice.
"Science has answers, or so we were taught in the ministry schools," he said. "I will not take issue with that. The miracle of life in all its complexity, all its variety and beauty, is explained. What to us seems a miraculous design, the wing of a dragonfly, the tail of a scorpion, a newborn's eyes, can be understood. Each structure, each being arising over the millennium, a blink of an eye in a long geological age of our world." "I'm sorry," he said in another aside. "Rickard, that was a big word, wasn't it? Don't worry, I can explain it later."
More laughter, especially from Rickard himself, his arm in a sling, flattered at being singled out twice.
"Each structure is an accumulation of small, slow, but brutal choices by nature, where those who possessed what was required thrived, and those who did not died. This is what science has taught us. Let us not forget its lessons, for science has brought light to our darkness, movements when we were sedentary, healing when we were wounded, truth where there was ignorance, even life where there was death. But that is not all science has brought. Behold the cruelty of the Elveds, the death, destruction, and ruin as witnessed by previous generations."
He shook his head with sorrow. Sabrina was unsure if it was genuine or for effect. Theopin continued in a soft voice as if choked with emotion.
"Science unlocked also brought death where there was life, pain where there was previously happiness, lies when we needed truth. Science has answers, but science does not have all the answers. Science, unguided, can be used for evil ends.
He let his words settle on the crowd. The believers were silent.
Science is not enough for our biggest questions, Theopin continued. Our dear leader Dagosta would say science is our answer. He would say that there is no master. But none of you are here today because you believe our dear leader, are you? And I ask you this, why don't you believe Dagosta? He has science on his side. He has proof. But what proof do you have of our master's existence? Are you all fools? Are you all mad?
Sabrina saw her uncle kneeling, a broken look in his eyes, as she and Lindsey teetered on the edge of the waterworks.
Don't try to follow us.
She pinched the bridge of her nose in vain effort to ward away a headache. Theopin had moved again, and she leaned around the rock wall to watch. A cadre of seated men and women in robes sweated behind him, their faces rapt, hands clasped. They often referred to her uncle. He was the antagonist in many of Theopin's speeches, and despite all that she now knew, Sabrina still felt defensive whenever his name was invoked, a protectiveness towards her uncle that she wished she could will away. Theopin repeated his last question, prompting the woman beside Sabrina to mutter a nonsensical, "Yes, yes." Sabrina lost the battle to keep the boy from ingesting filth as he clacked his teeth on a stone he had picked up. His sister had wandered farther down the hall, where she had curled up in a corner, her arms over her head, and closed her eyes in listless sleep.
Dagosta is not all wrong. Not all right, either.
More laughter. Sabrina felt the heat rise on her skin each time.
He is right because science starts with a question. Why? It is in our nature to question why. Why does the bird fly? Why does the scorpion sting? Why do we see with our eyes, not, say, our bellies? Why is a question we ask from childhood. Why does the sun set? Why do the stars shine? Why does the stone fall when I drop it? Why is water wet? Mothers, you can testify to your children's inquisitiveness. Why, they ask.
More laughter and clapping.
But the whys do not end in childhood, do they?
Theopin asked, his voice low now, his tone serious.
Why can't I find friends? Why can't I find love? What will I do with my life? What profession should I seek? Why do you love me? Why don't you love me? Why do we die? What is next?
The room was silent now.
You are all here because of the whys. The logical, reasonable, and even accurate answers of science were not enough. Those answers spoke to a piece of you, but not all of you. And they shouldn't. Our Creator doesn't want that. No, if you are looking for proof of His existence, look in front of you. Look at all who have come asking, why? Look inward, into yourself. At that same unending circle of questions that began in childhood and continues to this day. That flow of why has brought you here. Past dangers, over deserts, through pain, hardship, loss. These questions that science does not, could not answer. We are constantly driven to know more, to seek more. Science is one branch of this stream, but science is but a branch, a stream of a wide river. For even in science, as in life, once we have one answer, we are not satisfied. It is not long before we ask again, why? We always desire to have more. We all know there is no limit to the question, why? It does not stop with the sky or the stars. Otherwise, why would we be here? Does the bird question? The scorpion? The fish in the sea? No. But we do. We are driven from within, driven to seek despite the threat of death. And I will tell you now, there is no end. We will never stop asking why. Our spirits have an unending drive to seek truth. We are oriented to the horizon. But can we reach it? Not in this life. He stopped and raised a single finger into the air. Sweat glistened on his skin, and his robes rustled as he took deep breaths before plunging onward. But I say this. Only a divine hand would craft us in such a way that we would seek him. Only a divine hand would give to our hearts a compass needle that is not oriented north, south, east, or west, but to him, causing us to ask why in a way that no other creatures do. Our yearning causing us to seek. Our yearning, unlike the yearning of any other creatures, is proof enough of his existence. That he is there, waiting for us. That he loves us more than any other creatures. Theopin's voice crescendoed, and the hall erupted in cheers, cries, and shouts. The woman beside Sabrina fell to her knees, weeping, causing her son to stop chewing on his rock, and her daughter to open her eyelids momentarily. Theopin rode the wave of enthusiasm. And if science finds a way to explain this longing on our part, a question of the brain, a reaction among chemicals, and a ganglion of nerves, if science can explain it, will it explain away our master? No more so than if we find a scientific reason for why a mother loves a child. If science can explain it, does it make her love less real? No! I say, no! The cheering, the singing, the spontaneous eruptions continued for a few minutes before the noise died down. Theopin called for calm, his smile flashing across his face as he continued in softer tones. The road may not be a straight one for us. We may be traveling too far left, too far right in our journey towards him, but our master can draw straight, even with crooked lines. More cheers. He chose to shout over them now. We have seen that even an unbeliever can be used as an instrument by the master to teach us, and in the process be converted. He is using me. Now the woman turned to her, placing her hand on Sabrina's arm so that she could feel the heat of her body through her clothes. He is speaking to you, she said, leaning so close that Sabrina could smell her breath, which stank of rotting teeth. She pulled herself away gently, her ears ringing, her molars grinding against one another. And there will come a time when we'll all be tested. Theopin's voice was booming now, echoing off the ceiling and down the passageways. But remember that you have proof already. You have seen the proof. It is only for you to believe. Armed with that, nothing can stop you. Another wave of cheers and chants followed. Then the noise settled down into a general din as the elders behind Theopin stood up, left the stage, and returned, escorting 3 teenage children, 2 boys and a girl. Each was dressed for travel, with long robes protecting his or her body from the sun, head wraps, and belts of provisions around their waists and chests. The long knives on their hips did not escape Sabrina's notice, nor the fresh ink that had been tattooed on their hands and forearms. The crowd grew quiet again as Theopin introduced the newest pilgrims, as he called the Scrits. While they initially appeared nervous and unsure, looking to the elders and one another for cues where to stand and whom to face, as Theopin goaded them to pray and testify, they grew in their determination, their eyes fierce, their hands still bloody from the painful inking process rounded into fists. The girl's voice rang out especially loud, like a clarion. "Are you ready to go?" A voice next to Sabrina startled her. In her anger, Sabrina had not noticed Sprocket come up behind her. "Yes," she said. "I've heard enough."
Yellow hollyhock and lavender hyacinth stirred in the breeze that gently eased up the hillside. The heart-shaped leaves of a redbud tree twisted overhead. A buzzard alighted on a rock outcropping farther down the ridge, and a honeybee buzzed beside Sabrina's ear. She breathed deeply, closing off her awareness of everything but her target. She narrowed her eyes across the length of the blaster to the standing stone. It was scorched and cracked from previous blasts. The air between the muzzle of the weapon and the target shimmered with heat haze. Sabrina breathed out and pulled the trigger. A yellow ball of plasma exploded against the stone, setting it teetering. Sprocket's face was flushed from the heat. "Nicely done. That one's finished." Sabrina lowered the weapon, jerked the handle with her thumb, and sent the gun into a spin around her finger. Well balanced, it twirled better than some of the others she had adjusted for him that morning. Out of impulse, she flung it over her shoulder, caught it with the opposite hand, and switched hands again before dropping it into an imaginary holster. She did this without looking, and instead watched Sprocket's expression as he inched away, moving back again only when she handed the gun to him. "Why do you do that?" he asked. "Flair. I did it on patrol, at the shooting range, in the station garage, whenever there were others watching me. Good is not good enough when you're a female cadet. You have to prove yourself, prove that you are better, because in their eyes, you're always worse." Not so different from being an undersized man among soldiers," Sprocket said. It gave Sabrina pause. To her, men were men, but Sprocket, lean, shorter than average, would fall to the bottom of any hierarchy built on strength and speed. She felt an unexpected affection for him. "So you turned to machines?" "I was already good at them, but it gave me reason to excel." He set down the blaster along the row of weapons they had brought to calibrate. "Gave me something to feel proud about when I knew I was never going to be able to be captain of the pitchball squad." "But how did you ever teach yourself how to spin a gun like that without hurting yourself?" Sabrina chuckled. "With a lot of error. Once I was issued a blaster, I would practice in my apartment. I hit myself a couple times with a few stray stuns. Lindsey found me one day passed out in a pool of my own urine." "Did she tell you to stop?" "No," Sabrina said. She turned her face to the valley below, where children from the camp were picking fruits and nuts, and she tried to parse out the pang of sadness she suddenly felt in her gut. "No, Lindsey understood. She sculpted me a replica that afternoon, balanced perfectly. I practiced with it until I was flawless." She sat down with her chin in her hand. Sprocket came beside her and handed her the next gun. It was a projectile rifle. Sabrina snapped out of the thoughts that were weighing down upon her. "No, not those." "Why not?" he asked, the grass blade he had been chewing bouncing on his lips. "Those are only for killing. All the other weapons can be set on stun." Sprocket put the rifle down. "You really think they're going to keep these guns on stun?" "They could. Maybe they will. Maybe there is time to convince them to." Sprocket shook his head and sat down on a rock next to her. They both watched as the children gathered pistachios, adding them to the other fruits, oranges, lickeys, and olives, in their baskets. She noticed that he checked the sky reflexively. "Maybe," he said after a long while. He plucked a nearby piece of grass from the ground and replaced the frayed stem in his mouth. "About time we should be going." He stood and stretched. They collected the children from their gathering group. The rebels sent out a few such groups each day to forage for food. Children were often picked for these outings. They were eager for an excuse to leave the caves, but Sabrina silently objected, believing they should be in a school of some kind. Even an occultist teacher was better than nothing. Although Sabrina struggled with the discomfort of helping Sprocket repair weapons that would likely be used against officers, she was also grateful to leave the caves. It was an opportunity to be outside, to feel the sun on her skin and breathe fresh air. And, as much as she loved Lindsey, it felt like a reprieve from a ward for the mentally ill. Lindsey was happy, happier than Sabrina had ever seen her, and that mattered. But she knew her own presence was not permanent. It could not be. But where she could go next was unresolved. As she and Sprocket made their way over the last ridge to look down on the overhang that concealed the yawning opening to their subterranean world, she felt her heart sink. No matter how much time she spent there among the rebels, the place felt more like a tomb than home. Despite all the people, and even Lindsey, Sabrina was lonely in a way her friend could not understand. She was respected, feared, even revered after the fight that had sanctified her. But in the end, she was in the same place she began. Alone. She preferred the company of children, who were too young to form their own opinions or to understand what terms like sanctified or holy meant. To them, Sabrina was just another adult. She found herself playing pitchball and other games with the children, partly for companionship, partly to avoid conversations with believers that always strayed into topics she cared not to discuss. At least with Sprocket she could discuss the mechanics of the weaponry, a welcome change to the best posture for prayer or the right words to use when asking the master to heal a bunion or gout. But her conversation with Sprocket died if they strayed to anything else. In the end, Sabrina feared she was still the same person, the same child she had always been, standing on the edge of the playground, alone. Lindsey had changed that before. Sometimes she changed it now, when she was around. But as they entered the caves, Lindsey did not emerge from the throngs to greet her. She was likely busy teaching first aid, leading a reading circle, or learning one of the forbidden languages from Grange. The main hall was crowded, which Sabrina hated. She preferred eating later or sooner than everyone else. No matter what time she came, though she never asked, the women always wanted to serve her extra helpings. She shared her extra portions with the skinniest children, many of whom she was certain had intestines full of worms. Is freedom worth that? The air was pungent with smoke from the cooking fires, and her eyes and throat burned. Sprocket cursed as he noticed one of the ventilation fans had broken again. It would fall to him to repair it. The air seemed to make no difference to the rebels. They were gathered in tight knots on carpets, scattered haphazardly over the cave floor. Children romped on the stage, kicking a ball made of rubbish and twine, their footsteps sounding like the beats of a bass drum on the boards. Denalice was on cooking duty tonight, looking out of place among all the smaller women doling out food. Sabrina could not help smiling at his apron and how he had been forced to wear a wrap over his hair. A thick-set man with a forked beard, one of the soldiers, found Denalice's appearance amusing as well and made a crude joke at his expense.
"Keep moving, Jarrus,"
Denalice said.
"Cooking and killing people. Just be glad I'm doing the former tonight and not the latter."
The men behind Jarrus laughed, diffusing some of the tension among the women in the serving line. But Sabrina felt on edge, the back of her neck tingling. Something in the way the men spoke and laughed, the heavy smell of sweat and boiling masculinity, made her wary. With her bowl of food, she passed through a group of soldiers on her way to find a rug to settle on, wearing the mask of imperviousness she had learned to use in the station. When Grange entered the far side of the hall, she felt some level of relief. She found Lindsey at the center of a full carpet, 24 people gathered in a circle around her. The afternoon's reading session had gone over into dinner time. Sabrina knew there was little hope in visiting Lindsey over this meal, but she settled for listening to the conversation. A woman was asking something about understanding the master and his intentions. She wanted reasons for unexplainable things, such as her child dying. Sabrina thought a little more soap and hand-washing could have saved a number of children. Lindsey provided the best answer she could.
We can't understand his or her mind any more than an ant could understand all the things Sprocket knows in order to fix a fan, a turbine, or a communicator.
Sprocket, who had placed himself at the edge of the circle, smiled at Lindsey.
"Theopin says we can be free of suffering in the next life,"
a man said.
"That I don't know,"
Lindsey replied.
"Grange says we will only be frustrated if we try to find freedom from suffering. Instead, we should think in terms of freedom through suffering. Suffering is inevitable, but we can offer it as a prayer."
"But a prayer for what?"
the woman asked again.
"If I am but an ant to the master, what do my prayers for an end to our oppression matter to him? If he is so great, does he even notice my voice?"
Lindsey shook her head, her eyes filled with sympathy that seemed to draw the woman and all those around her closer.
I don't know. Sometimes I do wonder if he can hear us. He is the creator of the cosmos. It's not like you can invite him to dinner.
The crowd chuckled, and Lindsey smiled with them.
What I like to believe is that our whole life is a prayer, our actions making up the words, and the words sentences, and the sentences a story. And in the end, our life is like that. It's the story that is the sum of all our actions, and it's by this story that he knows us in our entirety.
The circle was quiet. Even Sprocket was nodding his head thoughtfully. Sabrina scraped a hardened piece of sauce with her spoon that had not been thoroughly scrubbed away since the bowl was last used. She scanned the room for Grange. She was tired of the conversation. Something about Lindsey's answers was making her angry, though she was not sure why. The believers would sit for hours arguing different points of view presented to them by Grange or Theopin, but Sabrina did not always see the distinction, when all of it seemed like make-believe to her. Shouts and the sound of scuffling disrupted the discussion. 2 figures tumbled out of the cluster of soldiers seated on the floor a few carpets away, and quickly fell to the floor, grappling. Sabrina dropped her bowl and ran between groups of startled onlookers. Her gait was unsteady, her right leg still sore. She had to struggle against the tide of people fleeing the mayhem and a stationary wall of soldiers who had gathered to witness it. Grange broke through the wall of onlookers moments before she did, and threw himself between the 2 men, unfazed by the stray punches that glanced off his shoulders and face.
"Enough!" he cried. "Are you all animals? Is this what we risked our lives for? To escape only to kill each other? If the master is with me," one of the men from the fight said, his broken teeth rolling across his swollen lips. His opponent, Jarrus, with the forked beard who had insulted Denalis earlier, mocked him, pounding his chest as if to insist the master was with him. "Don't speak to me about what he wills," Grange said, his face turning red under his silver beard, the veins in his temple growing thick. "If another man challenges his fellow brother, he will spend a month in the cages." The soldiers grumbled but dispersed, a few staying behind to help the man who had lost his teeth. Grange was already halfway to the exit before Sabrina picked him out of the crowd again. She raced to catch up, her sore leg protesting the exertion. She called his name just as a shard of pain twisted in her thigh. If he heard, he did not stop. She finally caught him in the corridor when he stepped aside to let a woman carrying a mat of bloodgrass pass.
"Grange, what did he mean, if the master is with me?"
He spun around, his nostrils wide with controlled breath.
"What do you think he meant?"
He turned back and continued down the hall. Sabrina grimaced, the pain increasing in her thigh.
"Grange, wait!"
He stopped, eyes blazing.
"That is the 5th fight I've had to break up this week. You may not have meant to, but you've induced a whole new belief. If I can do it, then the master must be with me. You've exonerated perpetrators and incriminated the victims at once. You have to know I never meant for that to happen. What choice did they give me?"
He sighed, placed his hands over his face as if in an attempt to wipe the anger away. When he removed them, he looked tired, the skin sagging beneath his eyes. He reached out to touch Sabrina's shoulder.
"I know. I'm sorry. It is not right for me to raise my voice at you. It is just that we are on the edge of a knife. Our people are so poised to go in one direction or the other, one of violence or one of peace.
Grange, even you carry a weapon. Even you have spoken of the need to resist and fight back."
"I know, but as I translate more, as I uncover more, I wonder if that is what our master truly intends. And yet—"
He paused, his eyes searching the corridor around him for anyone listening.
"And yet Theopin seems eager to use this new belief to have us march on the cities. If we can do it, then the master must be behind us. It is not without precedent in the text we've translated. An attack is coming? I don't know. I don't wish it. It would be ruinous for so many. If I believe in an alternative, if I represent an alternative, I fear I would be forced to take a side, to lay down my weapons. How much believability will my faith have if I don't?"
It was a question for Sabrina. She had no answer. She shook her head, her lips moving but no words emerging. Grange rubbed his temples with his palms and began to walk away.
I don't like being forced to do anything.
Sabrina followed Lindsey to the sanctuary at night. It was late. The buzzing of cicadas and crickets had given way to the melancholy cries of owls. No moon had entered the sky, but the stars were bright, so bright that Sabrina could make out Lindsey's shape against them, as well as the contours of the hillside and the skeletal shapes of the thorn trees. As they walked, Sabrina watched the sky warily, ready to spring to cover at the slightest hint of an Elved. But their luck held, and they reached the cave, the scent of beeswax and epoxy welcome. Strangely, the sanctuary had become one of Sabrina's favorite places, where the air was not thick with overcrowding, and she had Lindsey to herself. Lindsey greeted the guard and the two old men who were just leaving, their heads bowed and covered. Even in the darkness, their smiles shone when they passed Lindsey. Sabrina took up her customary place on the edge of the carpets, settling herself against the cool stone while Lindsey continued inside, her shadows mingling with those on the wall, so that multiples of her danced alongside the dark shapes of suns, swords, and moons. It was all a messy illusion to Sabrina, and yet she knew if this sanctuary were to disappear, she would mourn the loss. This confused her, since previously the place had aroused only disgust within her. But she could not deny the candlelight was soothing, its color as appealing as the colors in one of Lindsey's murals. She closed her eyes. There was so much she wanted to speak to Lindsey about when her friend finished praying. So much of the day played out before her mind's eye. Theopin's speech, her discomfort about helping Sprocket with weapons, the fight, Grange, broken teeth, split knuckles. It was all a story that seemed to be repeating itself, from a playground in Fortinbras to a desert refuge. When she opened her eyes, Theopin was there. He wore a wan smile. Soft light and indistinct shadows flickered back and forth across his face, the shading accentuating his high cheekbones and his well-set jaw. He did not blink. He had come too close without her knowing.
Thieves and murderers creep up on people, she said, and the penitent come to holy places with their voices stilled, to better hear the voice of the Master.
She said nothing. He seemed comfortable with the silence. Perhaps he was listening to that voice of the Master. He remained in place, his hands clasped neatly, his chin raised as if he were perched on a promontory, gazing out into a great expanse of desert, and not into the darkness of Weeping Stone.
I feel that you, Sabrina, will never believe like we do, he said after a long intake of breath.
He bent down next to her, his body folding gracefully.
Will you?
What do you want?
I want you to see, Cadet Sabria.
I am fine seeing what I can see,
says the infant who can only see the ceiling above her crib. But someday the child must grow, leave the nursery, and engage with the world.
His hands moved beneath his robes, and a blaster, her blaster, emerged. Her pulse quickened. Immediately she was calibrating options. With her left foot she could kick the blaster. With her right hand she could blind him with the dirt she was now slowly curling into her fist. But the blaster remained stationary, the handle facing her.
Take it, Theopin said. It is rightfully yours. I don't even know how to use one.
Sabrina took it, glancing at Lindsey, who was still deep in prayer. Sabrina flicked it on. The hum of the power cell, the weight, the molded handle in her palm were familiar and reassuring. Theopin continued to watch her, his face unreadable.
If you are willing to come with me, your suit is outside.
He got up to leave. Sabrina followed him around the corner a few steps, then stopped.
Why are you doing this? Because you are blind, Sabrina. And I know you want the truth. You never would have come to the center of the desert if you did not want the truth.
I was helping my friend.
Why did you help her in the first place? What had you learned to make you break your oaths?
He let the question hang in the air for a moment before resuming his exit.
Is that what you are seeking, Theopin? The truth?
She asked as she followed him to the cave mouth.
It is,
he said, turning so she could see him smile.
But we are all on our own journeys. Yours goes south. A day's walk from here is the wall. Follow the wadi out of the valley, then the Red Mountain Ridge. It will provide you cover. It is not safe. It is very dangerous. The wall is patrolled by soldiers in suits like your own, and Elveds. It is where the Elveds live, you see. A few buzz around the city cores, but they are truly demons of the desert. Their mission is not to keep the peace, but rather to keep us trapped inside here, away from the truth. Go stand on the wall and look to the other side, Cadet. You will see.
See what?
See what you are seeing.
He repeated her words back to her. Is it desolation on the other side?
Is it? Maybe you should look for yourself. I don't think you will believe me. Come.
Outside the cave mouth, he turned back up the hill and gestured to a thorn tree. From its pain-ridden branches, her suit hung like a soul.
Clean, oiled, and charged. A bag of provisions sits on that rock there.
Sabrina stepped close to examine the suit, inhaling the smell of mesh and the fresh oil on its joints. The bag next to it was full of water bottles, sealed packs of biscuits, and even a thermal blanket. When she turned to Theopin, he was already descending the hillside. Sabrina let out an awkward, "Thank you."
I will let Lindsey know where you have gone. Go with grace, sister, but go with haste. Cover what ground you can at night. Rest during the heat of the day. Be sure to come back safe.
Theopin's form receded into darkness.
So you can share your revelations.
Chapter 24. The Wall. Sabrina heeded Theopin's directions, descending the hill to the valley where she picked up the wadi and followed it south into the wide expanse of desert, the ridge that hid the caves sinking into the horizon to her east. Within her suit, Sabrina felt whole. Moshi's most recent model continued to surprise her. As she jogged through the gravelly, dried riverbed, the suit displayed a diagram of her body on the visor, indicating that it detected her favoring her right leg. The suit compensated, routing additional power to the flexors and servos in that limb. Sabrina felt the suit bend and constrict around her. At first, she resisted and nearly stumbled. However, once she gave herself over to the pressure, she felt the suit take over, moving first her right leg, then her left. She increased her speed without pain, the suit matching her pace, as if it was running for her, and she only had to drive it. With that, she pushed her jog to a full sprint, experiencing no more exertion than a brisk walk. She moved as if the wind was at her back, feeling as if Moshi had been standing right there and just bestowed her with another one of his precious gifts.
Thank you, Moshi.
The wadi wound like a road into the desert, her night vision transforming it into a landscape of emerald. The sky above was a darker shade of snowy green. 2 hours passed. Although the scenery was monotonous, Sabrina's joy was undiminished. She savored each soft, rhythmic cush of her feet in the grainy earth, the bounce of her ponytail on the back of her neck, and the warmth her body radiated into the cold desert night. After nearly 3 hours, and barely fatigued, the banks of the wadi grew shorter and eventually disappeared altogether as the riverbed opened up into a desiccated delta of crystallized hardpan. A wind picked up sand and rained it down onto her shoulders. Her night vision did not detect any ridgeline to the south, but she knew the distance on the setting was limited. She clicked the feature off, switched into the visible spectrum, and stepped into nothingness. Vertigo threatened to topple her to the ground as she struggled to regain any sense of orientation. With her naked eye, in the complete darkness of the desert, the distinction between the stars above and the crystallized hardpan beneath her feet was gone. Empty blackness closed around her like a fist, the profusion of stars mind-numbing. She felt as if she had stepped off a terrestrial plane into that cold, starry void, where the emptiness between points of light was eons and lifetimes, where she was a speck of dust, cursed with knowledge of her insignificance, certain that her intake of breath would be a sound heard across the cold, unfeeling universe. And in that void, that emptiness, there had to be something, someone watching. She could feel it, bearing down on her, with all the malice and vengeance of a being she had never believed existed. In all that emptiness, in all that coldness, there had to be some life force that lit the spark. She was scared.
What is wrong with me?
But then Dag was beside her, his arm around her shoulders as they sat on a bench in the old city. Waves crashed on the beach not far away while they faced the entrance to the tunnel that led under the city. It was the most direct route to the other side of the peninsula. As a grown woman, she had passed through it countless times, but this morning, as a child, she had yet to. As she stared at its mouth of gaping blackness, feeling its cold breath on her bare legs, she trembled. Moments before, she had been a warrior battling thieves in the deserted streets. But upon discovering the tunnel, real fear had struck her, and now her toy sword sat impotently at her side.
Why are you afraid?
Dag asked in a soft voice, a few stray whiskers that his razor had missed glinting silver along his jaw. As a child, she was unable to articulate the partially formed images that flashed through her mind, so Dag drew them out.
Are you afraid of some animals? Rats, snakes, or scorpions?
She nodded.
But what if I told you I walk through this tunnel each day on my morning strolls, and that I am certain there are no rats and snakes? Besides, I've seen you kill at least one of each of those with your sword there.
3 rats, 2 snakes, and 1 scorpion,
she said, the exact score very important in her 9-year-old mind.
3 rats? This proves my point exactly. They have more to fear from you than you of them. Is there something else about this place you fear? Maybe something you have not battled? Like ghosts?
She could not have said it. Even as Dag talked, she could only nod, but that indeed had been the cold grip inside of her chest. She pictured the invisible hands of the dead and doomed that had once walked these city streets reaching out for her, passing through her like cold gusts of air, draining her of her own life. Even at 9, she knew the importance of not believing in such things, and that belief would only disappoint her uncle. So, as she made her admission, she cast her eyes downward in shame, wiping tears.
Sabrina, my brave warrior, don't cry. It is perfectly natural to believe.
It is?
She asked, confused.
But you've told me I mustn't.
It does not mean your instincts might tell you otherwise. If a citizen steals, or worse, murders someone, I, of course, want to immediately punish them, even hurt them. That is my instinct. It is natural. But it does not mean it is right to follow it. The law calls for us to be better than our animal instincts. And just as there are animal instincts we must overcome, there are human ones we must outthink as well. And belief in the supernatural is one of the prominent ones.
Why do I feel it if it is not right?
Because it has helped us survive until now. We're wired for it. We are social beings that must navigate a world of other social beings with thoughts, emotions, and motivations. We relate to other people by trying to have what we call a theory of mind. It means trying to understand what another person thinks and feels in order to get along with them.
He gestured to her sword.
If you struck me with that sword, what would I do?
You would say, ow, and then be angry.
But how do you know that? It's because you can imagine in your head what is happening in mine.
She nodded, but she did not see how this related to the ghosts waiting for her in the tunnel. Dag continued.
But sometimes this wiring goes a little haywire. Sometimes it goes too far and begins ascribing thoughts, feelings, emotions to forces that have none, like the weather or the ocean. These are complex systems our minds cannot understand, so they try to impose this theory of mind on them. And that is how primitive people ended up with the notion of a god in the sky, or the sea, or in rocks or the trees. People want an explanation so badly they will settle for a false one if it resolves complexity and uncertainty for them. And by a cruel trick of fate, it was people with this mistaken notion that were able to reproduce, and to build stable societies. Perhaps this notion allowed them to build these societies. After all, what better way to enforce law than to tell people that even when they are alone, they are being watched by invisible figures in the sky? What better way to cure loneliness and the heartache of loss than to console yourself with the thought that, although your loved ones might leave you or die, there is an all-powerful being that loves you, or that your loved ones' spirits are preserved as immortal souls, or even ghosts.
As he spoke, her eyes wandered to the stone archway over the tunnel. Climbing vines spread around it, mimicking the curvature of the stones. A honeybee hovered over a flower before alighting and climbing within the blossom, his shape silhouetted against the shaking pink petals. A sea breeze found its way into the courtyard and shook the vine and blossom, and stirred dried leaves at Sabrina's feet.
So, these societies evolved,
Dag continued.
This flawed belief system, this flawed programming, so to speak, at their core. They evolved and spread so effectively that they crowded out any other societies, and now the laws of evolution took over. When there are no natural predators to check reproduction, certain traits grow out of proportion.
He repositioned himself on the bench, folding his hands on his knees and leaning over to look deeply into her eyes.
On one island, there was a beetle,
he said, holding up his fingers as if he held the beetle between them.
The male of this species used a horn on his head to defend himself against snakes. Females were attracted to the beetles with the largest horns, since this meant their own offspring would survive. Successive generations of males grew larger and larger horns. Snakes could no longer eat them, but then the horns grew so large that the beetles could only move very slowly, and as the horns grew even larger, they became the perfect handle for birds to swoop down and snatch them and eat them. So you know what happened to the beetles?
No.
They went extinct.
He paused, got up, then knelt down in front of her. She knew what was coming next must have been important. He took her hands in his.
Sabrina, humans almost went extinct too. And it was because their belief in the supernatural grew too large, their certainty and arrogance too big for their little brains. But there was no bird that came swooping in to eat the humans. Humans nearly destroyed themselves, using terrible weapons in the name of their very own deities. They ruined the planet, and as I have told you before, we are all that is left.
So we have to make sure our horns don't get too large.
He smiled.
Yes, even if they sometimes grow quite naturally, even if you are wired to see the supernatural cause before the real one. But we have two secret weapons, reason and the law. Those are our swords to fight arrogance, ignorance, and hate.
He gave her sword a sharp tap with 2 fingers. She swallowed and looked into the tunnel. Her breath still caught in her chest at the sight of the inky shadows.
So, there are no ghosts?
None,
he said, turning to look at the tunnel alongside her. He stood up, still holding her hand in his.
But I will go with you, this one time.
She picked up her sword, her fear dissipating like fog struck by sunlight.
I'm ready.
In the desert, standing on the edge of the cosmos, she watched the flashing heart monitor slow, her respiration become more even. She stared into the stars again, and knew the void facing her was empty.
The stars are only stars.
The wind rocked against her, sending a chill over her skin, and reminding her she needed to keep moving to remain warm. A look at the horizon revealed a silhouette against the stars. The ridge. She took a reading on her compass, set the direction, switched back to night vision, and resumed running, now confident that she was alone. The sun rose on an alien landscape, With the ridge as her guide, she had trekked south into desert scenery she could have never imagined. Hardpan crumpled underfoot, tilted at odd angles by wind and torrential rains. She passed through fields of volcanic gravel and deltas of green dust. In random seams of rock she found lonely curdy bushes and sage-grasses, all colored white, as if here in the desert only ghosts of plants could grow. To the west waited a sand sea. Giant dunes moved at a century's pace, their ridges curving back and forth like the path of a whip. In places, the dunes rose to the height of the ridge she followed, breaking through passes and spreading down the other side in a series of sandy deltas. The vanguard of the encroaching sea. The ridge she walked was the color of sunrise, its rocks wind-carved into bulbous shapes. Sabrina spied her first living animals, a desert hare, a snake, and a few lizards, all so perfectly matched to the color of their world that they seemed to be made of the sand and stone that surrounded them. The eastern side of the ridge was still in shade, its stone cool to the touch. She rested it for a few minutes, unzipping the vents in her suit and helping herself to a breakfast of water and biscuits from her pack. Her eyes were burning, and her head ached with sleepiness, but she wanted to travel farther before it became too hot. As the sun climbed, the shadow of the ridge narrowed. The readout on her visor indicated that the temperature was rising quickly. She found an overhang to rest beneath on the western side of the ridge. The space beneath was large enough so that she only had to bend at the waist to fit. The floor was rippled with fine-grained sand, no scrub, no cracked alkaline hardpan to hide scorpions. She took 2 more long swigs of water. Then, while pulling out biscuits, she discovered a flatbread sandwich of crushed peas and peppers. She ate it immediately, knowing it would not last as long as the biscuits, then leaned backwards onto the powdery sand to sleep. A fringe-toed lizard with a sandy back and white underbelly was cooling off on the underside of the overhang when she woke. The last few hours she had only dozed fitfully, the heat and brightness of the sky outside making it impossible to fall into a deeper slumber. A darkling beetle made a click-click-click sound somewhere nearby. The lizard's feet made a stiff scraping noise on the rock as it repositioned itself. Heat shimmered off stones like wavering air from a furnace door. She ate a few more biscuits, watching the lizard and its slow, deliberate movements stalking the beetle. When it finally caught the unlucky insect, and the miniature drama was over, she decided it was time to go. She removed her gloves from her belt and slipped them on. Almost immediately, her hands felt damp with sweat. She stretched out, taking extra time with her right leg, secured her bag over her shoulders, snapped her visor down, and stepped out of her shelter. Flames from the sun licked her back while the stones beneath her smoldered. Her face became wet with perspiration. She did not bother trying to find an easy way over the ridge. Instead, she relied on the grips in her gloves to allow her to gain purchase in the nearly sheer face, taking her up the spine of rock. Heat radiated through her gloves. The peak was cooler with a precious breeze gently wafting across, but she slid down quickly, reluctant to linger in so visible a position. She scanned the southern horizon, but no wall waited there, only more desert, flattened under the weight of the sun. For the first hour there was only a thin strip of shade to give her cover, making traveling brutal. The suit was sopping with perspiration. She removed her visor and covered her head in a cloth from the bag. Shade as precious a resource as water. By mid-afternoon, the rock and sand gave way to islands of green, acacia trees spreading their shade over ground that was no longer sandy, but rather fragrant with lemongrass and ginger. The profusion of smells lightened her mood, and she moved in a direction that took her beneath the trees. She even picked a stem of lemongrass and chewed it, as she had seen Sprocket do. She did not wish for this part of her passage to end, but a low rumble above brought back the reminder of the danger she faced. The screaming voices echoed off the ridge and into the hollows, making it impossible to guess where the Elvad was. Running to the ridge was too great a risk. Instead, she crouched behind a tree trunk, making herself as small as possible. The roar descended like a storm on the peaceful wood, the machine coming so close that Sabrina felt a flash of heat from its engines. Branches shook. Birds scattered. The Elvad passed, and diminished into the south as quickly as it had approached.
The wall. Where the Elvads live,
She ate again in the late afternoon, grateful that the forest spread unbroken, providing her shade and cover. Although the woods were quiet, it was a quiet that came with dread, as if the living feared the lumbering giants that raked the air with their screaming turbines and hissing flames. Eventually she came to thick groves of cedar that blanketed the valleys between ridges like a lush carpet, filling the air with their distinct scent. Even the wind that blew down from the ridges was full of the smell. It was a marked change from the worst of the desert. As evening descended and blue shadows stretched between hilltops, she chose to climb the hill to her east for an unobstructed view of the horizon. At the top of the ridge, she saw it. As long and unbroken and dust-brown as the desert itself, it looked like a rift in the earth, a fault line heaved upwards in a geological cataclysm. Closer inspection revealed symmetries and regularities that only humans could create. A perfect concave face, evenly spaced expansion joints, a railing running along the top. This was indeed the wall they had all heard about, but had never seen. It was their protection from the radioactive wastelands that covered the planet's surface, the Twin Cities' bulwark against chaos and ruin. She thought how small their patch of habitable space was, and how overwhelming the ruined wastes were. Befitting the scope of desolation on the far side where radiation had rendered the land uninhabitable, the wall answered back with its size, impenetrability, and an impression of infinity as its sentinel towers marched to the horizon in either direction, their crowns of glowing red beacons forming a chain of embers that shimmered in the fading light. Each tower had eyes, a wraparound floor of glass windows near the top where figures moved, only visible now as the day had turned to dusk and the light from within silhouetted them. But even as Sabrina watched, some timer clicked, and every window became a mirror, hiding the figures, the eyes of the tower becoming opaque once more. The watchers cannot be watched. Never in her dreams had she imagined the wall so large, or so occupied with guards in every tower. She counted 24 in each direction. She did the math. She had only seen 3 guards in the windows before they went dark, but even with 3 guards in each tower, with so many towers encircling both Fortinbras and Lysander and the lands between, it meant a whole city of people just to occupy the wall. But how could there be so many? Where did they live? And the construction. It behooved the wall to be so massive, so beautifully uniform, so brutally elegant, the line between the hope of the world and the end of the world, between life and death. Yet it was so far beyond the engineering she had seen within Fortinbras that she could not fit her mind around it. It would take an army to build, and an army to fill. She was loath to admit it, but Theopin had been right. There was much for her to learn.